Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Jamelle Bouie. He is a New York Times opinion columnist and also the host of the podcast Unclear and Present Danger. Jamelle, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me.
This week, you wrote about a column in the New York Times and then sort of followed it up with a blog post about that column, outlining the difference between, or I guess, the move of the Trump administration from being unconstitutional to anti-constitutional. Walk us through, broad strokes, the difference there.
Sure. I think most people understand what it means. The system is unconstitutional. It violates the Constitution. The administration recently was rebuked for its attempt to try to ban transgender people from the American military. And that was straightforwardly the court that said that this was unconstitutional action. Straightforwardly, you can't just discriminate against categories of people like this. You can't just say this whole category cannot participate. That violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And it's a straightforward kind of, you're operating within a sphere of power you have, kind of determining the composition of the military, the standards, but you're doing a thing within that authority that's just not allowed. That's unconstitutional. Anti-constitutional is more just rejecting kind of the very premise of constitutionalism itself, which is that you as an official of the government are not the sovereign in the society, right? Like you can't determine who exists outside the law or within the law. You are merely an instrument of the Constitution. You're an instrument of the will of the people, so to speak. And you are bound by laws, and you are bound by laws, and you are bound to operate according to those laws. And as well, you operate in a system where the government is limited in the authority that it can exercise. It does not have unlimited authority to do whatever it wants. And it's clear, to me at least, that the administration, in addition to doing all these unconstitutional things, is clearly making a set of anti-constitutional claims. It's saying that it doesn't have to listen to the legislature, and the legislature makes spending decisions. Now, the Constitution clearly states the legislature has the power of the purse. But the administration is saying, we can just cancel whatever they say. We can destroy entire agencies without their input. We have actually the legislative authority. And that both violates the Constitution, but is also a statement of authority of being above the Constitution as well. And I describe that as anti-constitutional. This thing where the administration is basically renditioning non-citizens to El Salvador on the basis of an accusation of gang membership without due process, that's also anti-constitutional. It's not just a violation of the law. It's not just a violation of the due process clauses of the Constitution. It is a statement of power, of sovereign power, that I, the president, have the right to decide, inherent in my authority, who gets to be here and who doesn't, and no one can review it. That is the kind of claim that you might find in a dictatorship, in an absolutist system, but it's explicitly against the very notion of a constitutional system. So I would throw that in there as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that sort of paradox. How can you claim that the president has inherent authority when it only exists, that supersedes the Constitution, when any authority a president has, or even just the existence of the president, is literally defined by the existence of a Constitution?
So this word inherent that the administration throws around, that, and I'm sure you'll remember this, that the Bush administration used to throw around a lot as well.
This is the unitary, like I was going to ask you, like, theory. How does this dovetail with the unitary executive theory?
It's this, so the first clause of Article 2 says the executive power shall be vested in the president. And there are a group of conservative legal scholars who read this extraordinarily broadly. They say that this vesting clause, that the executive power is this broad, almost amorphous thing that is separate from the enumerated powers in Article 2, and that vesting it in a president gives that president all kinds of authority to operate according to sort of what's inherent in being an executive. And so they'll argue, for example, that what's inherent to being an executive is the ability to hire and fire. So the president, therefore, has the ability to fire anyone in the civil service and doesn't have to listen to any congressional rules, judicial judgments about standards for removing someone from their position. They'll say that the executive has inherent power to execute a war, to fight a war, and that anything they do in relation to that is constitutional, is lawful, because of that inherent authority, and that anything a Congress or a judge might try to do to limit that is illegitimate because this isn't an executive's inherent authority. Now, I'll say a couple things about this. The first is that the U.S. Constitution is sort of famously a constitution of like limited government and enumerated powers. And although there are certainly implied powers that the various branches have, right? This is the holding of Macaulay v. Maryland, right? That the necessary and proper clause in Article 1 does give the Congress a set of implied powers. If you got to make a bank to do something that you have an explicit power to do, you can do it. And in the same way, there are some implied powers that the president has. To go back to kind of the military thing I mentioned earlier, if the president needs to set out standards for who can serve, the president can do it. The Constitution doesn't explicitly say it, but commander-in-chief, it's kind of implied. But this notion of inherent, that's not really constitutional, right? Like, because it says that there are all these powers the executive has that aren't enumerated, and that kind of just exists by virtue of that person being the executive. And to my mind, it's like a contradiction, right? Like, why would you go through the trouble? The framers spent a lot of time trying to figure out the powers the president has. Why would they have gone through the trouble if they had actually created an office with all this inherent authority? They wouldn't have. It doesn't make any sense. But there's
Let me just clarify. So in one instance, in the first instance, we're talking about subservient powers to an enumerated power.
Right.
So it's like, how do I go about executing, and the sort of subservient questions and issues that I might arise and decisions I have to make in fulfillment of that sort of like top line power.
Right. Exactly.
And then it also occurs to me that this notion of there being inherent powers, and those inherent powers are just sort of like this, almost like they emanate outside. Well, they literally do emanate outside of the bounds of the Constitution that have been written and offered to him. But this also seems to me to be a complete 180 of conservative legal thought from as recently as like 10 years ago, where the notion of any type of rights associated with anyone associated with government that wasn't specifically enumerated didn't exist. Right? I mean, am I wrong about that?
I mean, it's when it comes to rights that people possess, conservatives have tended to have an extremely narrow reading of what the Constitution provides, right? People believe they have a right to privacy, and conservatives say, well, it's not explicitly said, even though, I think we would all say it's clearly implied, right? The Fourth Amendment implies a right to privacy. They would say, yeah, it's not said, so maybe it doesn't exist. But when it comes to executive power, their view is that, in fact, there are all these inherent powers that cannot be violated. And typically this applies to Republican presidents and not Democratic ones.
Of course.
I think if you're looking for an explanation for this, I think you'll go awry looking for an ideological explanation. I think it's much more sociological, which is that the originators of unitary executive theory, the people who have been at the vanguard of trying to push this notion of an expansive, Dick Cheney, John Roberts, Sam Alito, name a few, they put out a few names. They cut their teeth basically in the post-Watergate era, when Congress, in response to Nixon, begins aggressively trying to limit the president, the War Powers Act, the Impoundment Control Act, the establishment of the FISA courts, like all these things that Congress begins to do to really try to limit the power of the presidency in the wake of Watergate, a scandal that we all know about. But it's worth saying that Nixon had won this one narrow popular vote victory, and then this popular vote landslide. Nixon is sort of making these what we'd recognize as like Trumpian claims about possessing the will of the people. And so these conservatives are they're like aligned with Nixon. They're looking at the congressional pushback to Nixon, and they're saying this has gone too far. they're weakening the president. The president, who represents the people, should not be bound by all of these illegitimate laws. And I think it's a very easy way to see how, like, these conservatives are kind of step by step laid down the theoretical groundwork, taken the legal actions to like unbound the presidency, or unbound the presidency that they believe to be bound.
This feels like a confluence between sort of like one strand of conservative thought that, of this unitary executive, that has sort of like mutated or commingled with this Curtis Yarvin a notion of a new monarchy. I mean, it's sort of like, in the same way that we've seen Doge and the Heritage Foundation sort of like meld in their agendas. It's almost as if this sort of these two strands of intellectual thought that ultimately lead to the same place have also sort of like commingled and created a more even, I guess, lethal strain of this ideology.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's like opportunism from the tech side of things, recognizing, well, it's a lot of stuff. It's the opportunism of the tech side, recognizing that there is this framework that allows for the exercise of, extra constitutional power. There's the fact that Donald Trump himself has I don't think that guy has any particular ideology or any particular beliefs other than what most benefits him. And what most benefits him is like this untrammeled, unaccountable power. That's what he wants the most. He wants to be able to be the ultimate boss. And then you have legal conservatives who see Trump as a vehicle for their interests. And so there's like this entrance convergence of these three groups, well, two groups and one guy. Two groups, one guy.
No, I mean that's it. I mean that's what it feels like, and they're putting it. They're putting it in action. What? I don't know. I mean, you could take even like the Boasberg case seems to be, and this is the deportation where he keeps asking, you need to provide me more information. And they're like, why would we? I mean, this seems to be the first case where they are inching closer to the idea of like, we don't really need to deal with the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me, I mean, as far as I can tell, or that Congress seems to be the one most but the one where they're already ignoring Congress's authority. Right. But it's a question of whether they're ignoring the authority of the court to adjudicate that question. Where do we go from here? It's like Boasberg. Give me your sense of Boasberg, because you brought up those deportations as like one of the more sort of like illicit acts, blatantly illicit. Like, what is your sense of what's going on there? Because it feels like Boasberg is like, he sort of, it seems like, knows that maybe this is he's at the fulcrum right now and doesn't want to be the one to sort of like declare a constitutional crisis. Right.
No one wants to bear the brunt of whatever is going to come next. I think you're right to say that that's the case where they're really pushing with just disregarding the courts altogether, saying that you don't have the authority to adjudicate these things. I don't have a great sense of Boasberg, the person. I figure that he's likely to be as much motivated just by the fact that the administration is showing such open contempt for him and open contempt for the proceedings as any particular theory. Frankly, I kind of imagine he's a Republican appointee, probably a conservative guy. I imagine that if the administration had come to him hat in hand, willing to cooperate, that he would rule favorably for them, right? He would be like, sure, show more evidence next time, but we understand what you're doing. The contempt they're showing for him and the court and the attacks on the court may lead him to the kind of negative ruling that the administration does not want. But then it's
or is it ruling they do want? I mean, it sort of feels them. I mean, it sort of feels like for them, this is their best sort of like from a public standpoint. This is their best polling, immigration.
Yeah.
They're, supposedly criminals, hardened criminals. They've put all the propaganda money into it. This feels like the case that they want to have, like, to create this crisis.
Right. And I mean, this is, we're in this, like, this realm of speculation. Sort of like, I honestly don't know what happens, right? If he rules that you got to bring these people back, that this is a terrible violation of due process, that we already have evidence that these people are not hardened criminals, and even if they were, they deserve a hearing, and the administration just says, no, we're not going to do it. Like, I'm not sure what comes next after that. My hunch is that no one really in American civil society, or very few people, have the stomach for this kind of direct confrontation with the president, especially over an issue like immigration. And so it'll be kind of like, well, it happened, we'll just kind of ignore it. But the problem there is that obviously the administration's claims to the kind of authority the president has aren't going to end there. The president's claiming the authority to rendition people without due process, rendition non-citizens or undocumented residents, then they're probably going to claim it with regards to just non-citizens in general. And it's a short hop and step there from just citizens themselves, right? Like anyone.
I mean, the lack of due process is really the sort of the line, right? Where and if you blow out the due process, then do we even know if it's a citizen or not? It doesn't matter.
Right. It doesn't matter because you'll have no way to prove it. And it doesn't feel like there's anyone willing to just, like, make that argument. Everyone's so afraid to say, listen, even if they are criminals, who's to say that if it's not, who's to say you're not the next person picked up because you look the wrong way, that you have the wrong tattoo? And how can you prove if you're innocent or not? Yeah, this is a little bit of an aside, but I continue to find the way that so many political actors are treating Trump as if he did win a landslide, and not as if he won the most exceedingly narrow victory you could win on basically the basis of groceries are too expensive. And so, to my mind, those are great grounds for political contestation, right? Like, you can say, what does this have to do with getting prices down? What does that have to do with anything? This is just like power-hungry nonsense. But there's this fear, and the more the fear is allowed, the more the administration's allowed to act unchecked by civil society and political society, the more that fear just grows, and the more real effective power they can claim, even if they don't have the legal power.
Well, I'm glad you added that aside, because literally the next thing I want to talk about was Chuck Schumer and the seeming, I don't know if it's a lack of alarm or if it's a lack of will or just bad strategy. And depending on which day of this past week you've seen him on television in his evolving sort of attempt to justify both what I think both, at least the tactical failure. I mean, I like, when Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi are going, when Nancy Pelosi's saying, you're something for nothing, and Hakeem Jeffries won't answer a question as to whether you should maintain a leadership, and you've got a cascading sort of, it seems to me, process of saying it's time for him to go. He failed. I mean, just as a leader, he failed. Even if you could somehow, agree with his strategy, I don't. But what is your take on this? Like, are we just looking at an ossified leadership? I mean, or just an incompetent one?
I think it's more ossified than incompetent. And there's certainly lack of competence there as well. But I think ossified is the big thing. I think there's this tendency to want to look for, nefarious external causes. I've seen some people speculate that, like, oh, maybe it's the donors or whatever. But I think it's a very simple explanation. Chuck Schumer is a man, and he's in the 70s, early 70s. He's been in political office for most of his adult life. He's been in this leadership position for, almost a decade, more than a decade at this point, or almost a decade. He was acculturated in a very different political culture than the one that exists now, and is encountering a new kind of political situation for which the old tools don't necessarily work, and is flat-footed. I mean, we have a whole aphorism about this. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, and we're in a situation where we have a lot of old dogs in political leadership who are struggling to deal with the situation. You aren't agile enough or creative enough to respond to what's happening, and I think that's 95% of it. It's almost it's a classic problem of human leadership. You see this thing happen again and again in all kinds of different contexts. And I think the solution is new leadership. It's people who have been acculturated in this political era and who recognize it for what it is, and who understand that the old ways of challenging the other side don't work, and that the proper orientation to have towards the other side may not be my misguided colleagues. It may just be they're my opponents and I have to beat them.
Right.
Right. And I think that there's a problem with that generation of Democrats viewing themselves as kind of responsible stewards of governance. And there is an animosity that really just seeps out of them when the base demands that they do politics. We're not, I think Schumer, Sam has described him before as a concierge, but, people aren't looking for you to kind of stabilize things while also giving Trump what he wants. People are looking for you to fight and use every point of leverage. And he's seemingly completely incapable of doing that. And I don't think he ever will be. And I think the problem goes deeper. Like I'm disturbed by Senate Democrats broadly. We're seeing a good amount of fight from the House Democrats and from governors across the country. But Senate Democrats, I feel like ossified is the best word for them. They have become so obsessed with institutional maintenance that I don't think they know what their role is other than that.
There is it's a wonderful novel, but I encountered it first as a movie, the great film The Leopard from 1960. And there's a lie, I believe it's both in the movie and the film, where a character, and the story is about Sicilian nobles at the time of the Italian unification. And there's a line one of the nobles has where he says, to keep things the same, things will have to change. Right? That you have these Democrats, this generation of Democrats, who want kind of a stable, well-ordered political system, and think that the way to get there is to maintain the old ways. But this is a situation where if you want to maintain that status quo, if you want that back, you actually have to change. You have to behave in ways. You have to try strategies that may appear to be radical in order to have the capacity to at least try to go back to the way things were. And that paradox, I think they're having a really hard time with. And I'm not even sure they can conceptualize what that would look like. Another way of putting it is that obviously everyone in the sense of partisan in one way or another, but a lot of Democrats don't appear to be the kind of genuinely hard-nosed partisans that understand that political combat is necessary, and that's part of what this is, and that the kind of genteel mid-century politics, or even politics in the 90s to an extent, although that's often overstated, just doesn't work, or it just isn't going to work for this situation, for this scenario.
And this isn't ideological. This is a more of a dispositional and partisan critique. I'm sort of agnostic as to why at this point why Schumer did what he did. The sort of the second. The sort of third order, I guess, is about like how poorly he managed his, the House, which was also like, if you're going to do this, why did you do it so badly that you're getting blowback from the House? But that's also a second order issue. Like, what do you think the underlying strategy should have been? Like, what should Schumer have done?
Well, I think this goes all the way back to the beginning of Trump's term, which feels like it was 3 years ago, but it was 60 days ago.
Gosh.
The initial strategy was clearly, so first of all, I don't think that Schumer or Democratic leadership, and I find this bizarre, had any sense of how radical and far gone things were going to get as quickly as they did. I figured that was going to be the case, right? I'm not going to say
They had been
anything.
They had been saying it,
right? I mean, they've been telegraphing it and saying it that we're really gonna go for it.
And supposedly that's what the Democrats were running on, believing that sincerely, and now they clearly didn't believe it sincerely, and I think voters picked up on that.
I think that they lost, and Trump won the popular vote, and even though it was the tiniest margin, this persuaded a lot of people, including I think Democrats in Congress, that the public was with Trump, right? And so we have to throw him a bone. We have to be accommodationist in some way, shape, or form. And so the initial strategy to sort of like, oh, we'll oppose the worst nominees for cabinet positions, but we'll throw some votes and we'll confirm people who seem mainstream. That was the original sin, I think, right then and there. Because it's hard to jump from that to a position of like maximal opposition. It's hard to sort of like finesse that. And Schumer couldn't. Schumer could not finesse in a transition from we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt to now we're going to let the government shut down because he's too dangerous a threat. He was a dangerous threat the whole time. So why now and not then? I think that the way things should have gone is that from the jump, from the top, we're not going to give any votes to Trump nominees. They're all going to be unqualified. They're all going to be destructive, and our fingerprints are going to touch any of it. And if they want to do a partisan funding bill, we're not going to touch that either. And when the Doge stuff started happening, when it became clear just how authoritarian this administration aspires to be, that orientation would have given them the ability to say the only thing that's going to bring us to work with Republicans is if they cut all this stuff out. But that was a lost opportunity. And now I think, Schumer's obviously flailing and Senate Democrats are basically leaderless.
I mean, it feels like to some extent the entire party is leaderless. I mean, let's just move briefly to what seems to be a nascent sort of like a fight for what comes next. And part of that is 15,000 people in Arizona going to, I guess a speech, a rally against oligarchs. Bernie Sanders, AOC on this tour. And these are numbers that sort of like are significantly larger than when Sanders ran for president in 2016. And, you don't often see this level of engagement in politics a month and a half into an administration. Like the equivalent time for this in the Biden administration, Republicans were enraged about Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
And that was it. Simultaneously, there's this sort of new, maybe not new economic doctrine of abundance that is being really aggressively pushed, like in a way that I don't ever recall seeing. It's ostensibly from a book by Ezra Klein and I can't grasp
Derek Thompson at the Atlantic.
But it's there's a whole strategy that's been put out by the Nicholson Center, which is a sort of a Koch derivative, sort of libertarian ish centrist think tank. What do you make of all this? I mean, is there there's a fight for what comes next before we really have sort of finished, there's still a grip on the Democratic Party, until I guess Schumer goes down, but I guess people are anticipating this.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about political leadership is it's like inherently entrepreneurial, right? Like just because you have a formal position doesn't mean that people recognize you as like the leader of a party. That's at least not the American system, right? Like unless other than the president, uncontested leader of his party. But if there's no president that your party has at the moment, then it's a very fluid and flexible thing. And I think that this is what this is sort of people trying to establish a claim to leadership. I think it's more, so I would kind of separate the AOC Sanders thing and the abundance thing, because I think that the former is an attempt to make a claim for popular leadership of Democrats, and AOC in particular, who has been sort of who is at the forefront of opposition to this continuing resolution and has been like a vocal opponent of Trump. It's clearly emerging as someone who rank and file Democrats, not just progressive Democrats,
Right.
but like ordinary Democrats, see as a leader, someone who's leading the party. And Bernie already has this status with many Democratic voters as well. So I think they're trying, in the absence of any attempt to do this from more centrist Democrats, I suppose Chris Murphy is trying to do some of this, but it's not in the same popular way. Governor Pritzker is trying to do this to a certain extent, but there aren't that many Democrats trying to make this explicit claim to popular leadership. But I think that's what they're doing.
But it's
the
also
abundance
like,
argument,
but
seems to me more elite focused. It's more saying to Democratic elites, right? Like, here's what we think the perspective for the next Democratic policy agenda ought to look like. It should be more focused on building state capacity, on freeing the government to be able to actually produce things and build things effectively and efficiently. It should be focused on removing barriers to all kinds of stuff.
Right. But and that argument, you can have that argument. I don't necessarily think it goes far enough, right? It's not, we have to build affordable I mean, it's not just zoning stuff, but like, it feels like to me, this is an effort to have the same folks making the arguments about where the Democratic Party should go from here, while reframing it and calling it abundance and cutting out the existing critics that were saying that this is the wrong way to go, while still centering these same voices in the conversation. Like what AOC and Bernie are doing is building off of the discontent, and basically it's a bit of a victory lap, I guess, for their brand of politics. And what I don't love about this kind of very focus-tested elite abundance kind of push here is that it seems to be like a way to consolidate power with those same folks who have been a bit discredited by the way the Democratic Party is at its lowest point since the early 90s.
So I'm actually not sure that's the case, in part because the abundance folks aren't really making a political argument, right? This is actually one of the criticisms of the book, is that it doesn't have much of a theory of politics behind it. That it really is, it's much more technocratic than that. I think that it may be important to. All right, I'm going to pull back a little bit. The fact that part of the argument of the book and of Ezra and Derek is that there are aspects of American political economy that are not conducive to the production of things that people need is like a different kind of argument than the DLC. You know, we need to get government out of the picture. I think the abundance argument is much more about like what can we do to enhance state capacity, which may mean looking at things that the government does not particularly well, versus we got to get the government out of there entirely, and that the private sector is the best place to make things happen. But regardless of the practical differences, I think these are like two different things happening simultaneously, and it's like really not that hard to imagine a kind of populist democratic energy like you're seeing with AOC and Sanders merged with this sort of like, we got to make it easier to build public housing, right? Like that's a very natural kind of thing. And you can imagine kind of a left inflected abundance kind of political orientation, but also like a right inflected one as well. I think it's a little bit separate from the claim for political leadership, or the bid for political leadership.
Well, Josh Shapiro's embracing it, right? And that's my concern is like, it's a bit of circling the wagons, where I want this to be a worker-led resurgence in the Democratic Party, to reorient it past appealing to Republican suburbanites, which seems like it still is a fever that won't break with Democrats, frankly. That's my concern. Yeah.
I'll say I don't necessarily think the abundant stuff would appeal to Republican suburbanites, because part of it is like you have too many property rights. part of the argument is that like homeowners have too many property rights. This is why I'm not sure it's a political thing, because the actual politics of it are kind of not popular with even some of the new members of the Democratic coalition.
I think
I live in a college town, and I will say for 100%, when you say to people, it should be easier to tear down a shack and build like a public apartment, they lose their minds. And these are liberal Democratic voters.
I think that's true. And I think, the timing for this obviously was sort of like a hoping that this was a Harris administration. I mean, it reminds me of what we saw with antitrust in 2012, 2013, where there was trying to build an infrastructure there. But it does feel, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of like right now, it seems to be like an ideology without a political base, other than sort of like people potentially searching for an ideology to go forward, because there's sort of I think there were people who felt during the Biden administration that the antitrust and the labor people were able to sort of like plant their flags, but nobody else from an economic standpoint. But that is inherent in the what AOC and Sanders are doing on some level. Like, I mean, it's much more of a political project, but they come with an ideology. And so it does feel like there is an attempt to sort of like, and I think it's happenstance. I think they thought this would be this book would be coming out in a very different circumstance.
Right.
And it's sort of, this is a book that's been planned to come out probably for a year. And I think they would not have anticipated, because it really depends on what kind of infrastructure gets built in the wake of this without the resources that they anticipated existing, because a lot of those resources are going to go towards like, hey, Donald Trump is president, we've got to fight him, as opposed to sort of like, we need to, work on, and I guess maybe we'll see this, the application of this more on sort of a local level, or an attempt anyways to do it there, because obviously there's no federal apparatus. Give me your sense before we let you go. How much time do you think Schumer has? Do you think that like this is going to, are we going to start to see the same cascade we saw with Biden?
It certainly seems like more and more Senate Democrats was it Michael Bennett yesterday was like, maybe we need new leadership. I think we'll see more Senate Democrats voice that. I think if because Schumer's flailing right now, it's one thing to mess up, right, and like really damage your credibility. But if you can recover from that, it's possible. It's possible to be able to reorient yourself, to be deft enough and agile enough to reorient yourself and recover. But he's just flailing the entire time, and I think the more he flails and the more kind of pathetic it kind of looks, the more you'll see Democrats just say, we got to get someone new. And so as far as how much time he has, I don't know, it could be a month, could be a week, or maybe there's no will within the caucus at all to find new leadership. But that's what happens, and I think things are way worse than we even think now.
Totally. It does feel like that time where everybody was like, well, let's wait if Biden comes out and gives a really banger interview and prove that he can do this. But I think Schumer had a, really like a sort of a multi-layered level of a mess up. He both chose a strategy that was not aligned with the base, and then was incapable of communicating it to his peers and to the House. And now seems to be incapable of delivering some type of explanation, as you say, in media. Jamelle Bouie, New York Times opinion columnist and host of the podcast Unclear and Present Danger. We'll put links to all of that, of course. Thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks,
Jamelle.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.